In this video, I'm finishing up the tutorial of the Fantasy Photo Composite, which I posted the first part of about a year ago, and I've gotten some rather frustrated comments on that video, as well as a couple of dislikes and probably a few unsubscribes as a result of that. But since I do these for students in my classes primarily, then it's not as big of a deal as far as the YouTube channel is concerned. But I am finishing this up today, and you'll also notice that I started this on a PC because I was working at home, and I'm finishing it up on a Mac because I'm doing it in my office. And one of the questions I get most often is, which one should I get in terms of graphic design, a Mac or a PC? And the answer is either. Do whatever you want. So I thought I'd throw that in there as a little extra. The files pass back and forth without any issue at all that I have detected. Also with this, my mouse's batteries are dead, so I'm using entirely the Wacom and the keyboard. So this could be a little bit clunky in terms of my ability to do basic things. I usually use a combination of the two, because the Wacom's better for some things, the mouse is better for some things, but in this case I'm just going to go full Wacom. Now, we left off with coloring the figure's hair. All our elements are in place. Essentially, the structure is in place. Now it's a matter of the treatments that blend everything together. So some things have to be desaturated. Some things have to have color added to them. The ship obviously was taken down almost entirely to black and white because I expect the sun sitting behind it to have a really big impact there. So beginning with just a couple of things. Taking the figure, I'm going to add a hue and saturation. Actually, I'm probably just going to do this destructively directly to the figure from the top menu rather than using an adjustment layer, because I just need to knock down that saturation a little bit. I don't want to lose all of my color, but I'm going to do the same thing to the sunset just to reduce it some. The more I pull it back, the more easily these colors will play with one another. And so typically I pull it up further, but I want to retain some of this inherent color, so it's not just a monochromatic image that I create at the end. So a little decrease to the figure, a little decrease to the sunset itself, and then it becomes about blending elements, bringing stuff in, adding light, etc. to make this cooperate a little better. I'm going to throw a photo filter, which I don't use these a lot. This is mostly to just demonstrate that it exists and it can be used. And I'm going to use the photo filter at about 40%, I think. That's pretty intense. It adds quite a bit of color to it. You can see the drastic difference. You can also already see how that begins to affect and create a forced color harmony between elements. It basically causes the color to coalesce, whether it wants to or not. Now I'm also going to mask some of that out, because I want it to be warmer in the distance and then get cooler up front. So this means that with a mask, I'm going to give myself a decent sized brush, set it to about 30%. Just brush some of that out, let it be cooler up front, warmer further back. That helps retain some of the color and gives me a natural transition in temperature, because depending on where the light source is, you're going to either have cooler or warmer one place and another. There has to be a difference in temperature across an image, even if it's subtle. And you'll see this if you pay attention looking at natural photography, even that there's a difference in temperature from shadows to light source. I'm going to take this opportunity as well to throw in some fog, I think. There's a couple of things to do, one of which would be to go back here into the sunset and add some fog artificially, and then we'll actually use a literal photo. And one of the reasons why I want to do that is, obviously I wasn't able to clean up a whole lot behind the ship here without destroying the rigging, and I can see very clearly into the background. To help give this more of an ethereal thing and cover my mistakes, honestly, fog is a really good tool for doing that, and so I'm going to add some to help with that illusion. So that's going to go above the sunlight. And I'm going to call this back fog. Why not? And I'm just going to subtly add some. I might even try one of my fog brushes here that I have. This could very easily be done with just a soft brush, but sometimes I like to test these out just to see. So I throw in a little bit of white and build that fog up. What you start to get is a more natural appearance. And it's going to show up behind the ship because of the layer arrangement. And as I add this fog, all those spaces in between where I did not clean up behind the rigging start to look more natural and reasonable. Starts to make better sense. So this adds a sort of natural diffusion. Right here, very close to the ship, I'm really going to lay on some of this. Make it more dense. Try to go right behind the ship here. That brush adds some good variation, gives it more of a realistic depth. And it doesn't look completely natural at this stage. We're going to do more to it, but it gives the feeling of a ship kind of coming through the fog. So that's my back fog. And then I'm going to place in as it thinks about it here. It's probably just going to be easiest if I search for it. My computer doesn't want to move particularly fast today. There it is, fog JPEG. I'm one of those people who keeps a unreasonably messy desktop. I admit that. Alright, so I have this fog image, and I'm going to move it so that it is in front of the ship but still behind the figure. I'm going to rasterize that so I have the option to erase from it. And then I'm probably going to use a mask rather than an eraser. And use my fog brush since I'm kind of liking the effect I get. Again, I could do this with a soft brush, and I usually do, but I have these brushes I downloaded. Why not use them? My goal here is to give this the feeling of coming through the fog, as though some of the ship is covered in this kind of low-lying fog, and then some of it is not, as though it's pushing through it. So right now my focus is just to create a band that goes across and to get rid of these hard edges to the image. And then I'll go and start dropping the opacity, pulling it back, trying to give myself a more realistic look. Obviously right now that's pretty dense fog. In fact, it looks like smoke. I might play around with different blending modes, but I think I need the solidity. I think I need that. All I'm going to do instead is drop the opacity some so you can still see the ship, and then I'll go in and these areas that are furthest forward, I'm going to reduce and allow the ship to come through. Especially, I have no idea what this is called because I don't know ship parts, but this this long pole that comes from the front, I'm sure somebody knows what that is and can tell me sometime, but reduce this overall up towards the top. reduce it some there. I might even drop my brush opacity and just start reducing some of this overall, especially over here on the edges. Just allow myself to see a little bit more and drop that opacity just a bit further. I think I'll erase some of that fog there, is also just let that sunlight through from that sun that I added previously. Really let that come through, and that again grants credence to this idea that this fog is being illuminated from behind and therefore creating kind of this sheet of white. I'm also going to take that back fog layer that I did earlier, and I'm going to add some more to that, especially along the horizon off in the distance, because that would start to get very hazy. So that the horizon is near invisible. So we're already looking a little better. I think I would also, even from that, add an additional fog layer. I'm probably spending way more time on the fog than I should, but I like the effects that you can get from adding a little bit of that. Add some of this up front. And then also work it back some. I like to, when I'm working in Photoshop, add in more than I need and then take away. That kind of gives me a clearer idea of what I'm shooting for. And a lot of this becomes judgment. You know, how much do I actually need? How much do I actually want? Etc. Alright, I'm going to abandon the fog right now. There's probably quite a bit more that I could do to it, but I'm going to abandon it right now just for the sake of speed, and move on to some other things now that this is beginning to blend. It's beginning to look more reasonable as I make account for these differences in the photos that I brought in. With the figure, I'm going to add a few additional shadows. So I'm going to add a curves layer on the figure. This could also be done with a color, but I'm becoming more and more fond of using curves layers for this type of thing. I'm going to clip it to the figure, and I'm going to add some shadows in. Just really kind of darken it. And then I'm going to select the mask of that and hit Command-I to invert it. That's Control-I if you're on PC. And then using a soft brush, I'm going to paint some of those shadows back in by using white. So I turned the mask entirely black to remove all of it, and now I'll remove some of the mask itself, revealing more of that shadows that were created by the curves layer. Sorry, my brain got to thinking about 4 or 5 different things while I was saying that sentence. So just adding some darkening to the figure as though light is indeed coming from the front. I want it to be a subtle effect though, so not anything significant. And I would do something similar in terms of highlights. So I'm going to add another one. And you know, I haven't tried this one in this particular project, so let me see how this works. I'm going to create an exposure and clip it to the figure, just like the curves layer, for highlights. And I'm going to increase that exposure. Same thing, invert the mask, and then go back and brush bits of it in where the light would most likely be hitting. So say along the shoulder, along the top of the head. That hair could use some work, but I'm not going to worry about it too much right now. edge of the arm, stuff like that. Places where the light would indeed hit. Since there's so much fog, this light would be significantly diffused, so it would be more of a warm glow than anything else. It's a subtle effect, but that's what I want. I want just some subtlety. Trying to decide what else I'd like to do. I think we'll add in a little bit more in terms of the light itself. So with that sun, I'm gonna throw in another layer, and we're gonna make this like sunbeams. And I'm not entirely sure how well this is going to work, but we're gonna try it out. It's just if there is all this fog, it would make sense that there are some beams of light breaking through. So I'm going to try and vary these sizes some. Just using the polygonal lasso tool to etch out the basic contours, which I do this technique on several different videos. In fact, I think I'll hold shift and add just a little bit more. Coming down like right there. A little bit more in terms of height up here. I'll take that, edit, fill. I'll choose a color, something in a pretty intense orange. Set that to something like screen. I like screen for that. Hit Command D to deselect. Looks great right now, of course, but I'm probably going to take a couple of steps to make it look like actual light. I blurred it some with a Gaussian blur, and then I take either an eraser or masking, whichever seems appropriate, and reduce and remove some of these. Obviously you're going to get less of it right there because that just doesn't make as much sense. It's not going to get stronger as it goes further away from the sunlight, so I'm going to reduce those, but I like this little bit that you can see coming through there. I'm just going to try and use some good sense. To soften up these edges in a way that seems semi-realistic. So you get a few beams of it coming through. Do a copy of that. Lock the transparent pixels and paint that additional copy white, which will most definitely be more than is necessary. And then I'll use the opacity of that to increase some areas and decrease others. So back to the eraser again. I want subtlety above all other things. we go. So there's some additional light in the background to help make that seem a bit more realistic. And now let's add some color effects. So I did a forced color harmony earlier. I'm going to add another one of those that's more in the vein of yellow, rich yellow. Decide whether I like the soft light or the overlay. I actually think I might need an overlay. Very low opacity overall, but something that gives some treatment, and overlay versus soft light, which are two that I typically use for brightening. You can see it has kind of an intensifying effect on what's in the background. That fog, making it seem a bit more dense. And so it's useful to me in that respect. Again, I don't want to overplay my hand though in terms of coloring too much up front. So I want it to be a stronger effect in the background, and while still present, a weaker effect up front. So I'm going to brush some of that out. Then I'm going to use an overall color balance to boost the warmth a little bit as well. It's so easy to overdo this, and I probably will still end up overdoing it some. Simply because I'm in a hurry, and I would sit here and tweak these things for quite a long time, more than likely. I just feel like I gotta give something to the shadows there, in terms of a little bit more blue. So you can see that get a little bit richer, but I don't like the effect it's having on this corner up at the top, so I'm going to mask that out. Now right now my shadows are not consistent in terms of depth, so I'm going to use a curves layer. Add a point right there and pull this up to soften those shadows. You can see the difference that it makes there from where it was to where it goes, because I need the ship especially to feel like it's more distant, so the shadows are softer. So what I'll do is an overall rather than clip to something, invert that, and then go in and brush some of this shadow adjustment back in onto the ship to make it feel further in the distance. Do the same with some of the shadows on the water here, just to create that difference there between figure in the foreground and the background. Still probably going to soften her up a little, but not to the extent that I did the ship. So that gives me a greater sense of distance. Now I'm going to throw on an additional curves layer. I like to stack these things, since that one has mask all over it, and this one's going to be used for the basic split toning, which is cooler shadows, warmer highlights. Just throw a little bit more blue into it. I just messed something up, so I had to hit Command Z. A little bit blue in the shadows, a little bit more warmth in the highlights. Bring in kind of a rich orange. Set to soft light, maybe 10%. I'll sit here and mess with percentages much longer than I actually need to. It's more a habit than anything else. You know, I'm kind of curious. I've never tried this before on this particular project either. kind of curious to what would happen if I add a little bit of film-like bloom of color to the sunlight itself. So if I add a layer that's just for color dodge, which is very intense, you know what? That's not bad. That's not bad. Let me toy with that for a minute. So I will use a radial gradient with the gradient tool. Pull directly from the sun, and that's going to throw on this huge bloom of light like that, which is obviously too intense. It's much too intense. But you almost never leave a color dodge layer at the opacity that it starts at. You never leave it at full opacity. So I'll drag it down to nothing, and then I'll boost it up little by little until it starts to have the effect that I want. And I kind of like that. Maybe even push it further, exaggerate it some. Now, one of the raw effects that you get from something like that, the negative effects, is you'll see some of it start to appear on the figure, and then that area might need to be erased. Because we want a little bit of that light bleeding over, but not necessarily a ton, because you can see the change in color it then creates on my figure. And I don't want that type of severity, so I'm going to erase quite a bit of that, which is going to help the figure stand out all the more and represent more realistically what would happen if there was a bloom of light coming from the figure. I also do a little bit of that, not a ton, but a little bit of that on the bow of the ship and the shadow that would likely come from it. I could spend so much time detailing that, but I'm not going to. So that gives me a little bit of a sense of realism as well. Maybe some of that on the sails up here on the top. Obviously quite a bit of that light's going to bloom through, but not all of it. So make an adjustment there to help with that. Now let's do some sharpening. Because I think I'm pretty much done with this aspect of it. Oh, I forgot to put a couple of layers in there. Put all those together into, I did it again. Select all of your layers. Don't leave them out like I'm doing. Select all of them. Put them together in a group. Duplicate the group. This is the same old sharpening method I'm always showing because I like it. I could use a high pass method, which I've used in other videos, including the sharpening tutorial, but I honestly just don't like anything as much as this one. It gives me by far the best results and the most flexibility with the sharpening. So 2 copies of my layer in there, invert one with Command I, set the blending mode of the inverted layer to vivid light, set the blending mode of the folder itself to overlay, and then apply a surface blur to that top inverted layer. Right now it's set to a radius of 8. If I zoom in here, it's pretty easy to see. That's a severe sharpening. So I'm going to drop it to 7. A single pixel can actually make a pretty big difference. And I think I'm going to leave it there. It's still more sharpening than I want, but what I can do then is reduce the opacity of the folder and bring it up little by little until I get the amount of sharpening that I actually want. Okay, there's one other piece that I'll do in this tutorial, which is the text that gets placed over it. So, see if I can find that file. The challenge is always finding the file, because I do these tutorials multiple times. It always looks a little different every time I do it, but I do these multiple times and then I have to go hunting for the images that I use in them. This is it. This is that kind of goes around the edges to convey the idea of the story here. I have no idea what this says. I just found it on Google Images. I don't recommend doing that for actual graphic design pieces you do for commercial purposes, because if you read it, well, for one thing, I don't own the image, but if you read it, it might have, I don't know, unsavory things in it. The text itself, I inverted it to turn the text white, and then I can use the screen blending mode to make it stand over the image. And it's probably best if I mask this. I just want it to be up sort of around the edges. So I'll reduce it in areas where it doesn't belong. And then I'll probably drop the opacity a little bit overall. Just sort of hovering around the edges there. This whole image as well could probably use, I'm going to use a levels layer. Just to throw on some darkening, some deeper shadows. And I'll use this to create sort of a vignette, but not quite, because I don't want it to go all the way around the frame. I just really want to darken some of this down here by the rock to draw less attention to it. I want the eye to be moved upwards. So then in the example image that I did for this is a poster and it has text on it. It's about reading. You know, it says adventure across the bottom. But not going to go through that whole process here. Rather, I just want to kind of leave it there as the second part of this, the first part of the tutorial being putting the structure in place, and the second part of the tutorial being treating it so that everything sort of blends together.